The subject of this morning's hearing is two bills. Bill 24-570, Schools First in Budgeting Amendment Act of 2021, and Bill 24-571, Schools Full Budgeting Amendment Act of 2021. I'm going to read from the hearing notice, and then I'm going to have a statement. Bills 24-570 and 24-571 are aimed at changing the way we budget for schools. Year over year, DCPS schools experience budget cuts, disrupting their ability to effectively plan for staffing, programs, and services that students need consistently. Bill 24-570 is a prescriptive approach to revise the method for school budgeting. By budgeting the local schools first, based on each school's previous year's budget, adjusting for inflation, with the remainder to be allocated between the remainder of the overall DCPS budget to be allocated between central administration and school support. The stated purpose of Bill 24-571 is to require, simply, that each year's annual budget for each local school within DCPS is no less than the school's budget for the current school year. The goal of both bills, with their differing approach, is to better protect schools from reductions in funding and to provide a stable foundation upon which schools can plan for meeting their students' needs.
Despite months of requests and letters, we still don't have mock school level budgets for next year. I am intrigued by today's bill, but want to emphasize that my goal is to make sure whatever we do, we have transparency around the use of at-risk funds. DCPS has continuously ignored the law that these dollars be used to supplement, not supplant, base funding.
A few weeks ago, we reached out to DCPS in anticipation of their new budget model being rolled out this year to ask that they begin to share information. The correspondence that we received back from DCPS, what's the word? Less than informative. That's not even, that we'll call that. The response we got back from DCPS was less than informative.
The first question before us is whether the council should legislate the formula for individual school budgets. In theory, I think budgets should be formed by DCPS with input from principals and parents. But the way schools cower in fear of sudden cuts, even during flush times, does not work for our schools. Further, the new budget model rollout has been so egregious in its secrecy and contempt for the council and for parents that the council must act. One official described the new budget model as a cake that was baked years ago, but then delayed for the pandemic. But DCPS won't tell us what this cake looks like. When I pick up my daughter's birthday cake, I certainly want to see if the decorator spelled her name correctly before the party.
Here's what we want, at least what I want as a member of a school community. We want to not have to cut our staff positions each year, which means holding harmless staff positions, not dollars. And this is complicated because even holding the same number of total staff constant would not work, and in some cases require substantial cuts to schools.
I have prepared simulations of the effects of both bills with the only data currently available. And that means what would the results have been if either bill had been law governing the calculation of the current year's budgets. The Schools Full Budgeting Act would have helped very little. Only 17 of 114 schools received fewer dollars in this year's budgets than they had last year. The bill would have done nothing for the dozens of schools that had to cut staff and/or services because the budgets they received were insufficient to cover all the costs which they're being charged. The other bill, Schools First in Budgeting, seeks to solve this very big problem because it guarantees funding to cover salary increases, inflation, enrollment increases, cost increases in special education and English language learner programs, and any costs newly shifted into school budgets. This is the minimum that needs to be provided. It's a guardrail against backsliding.
It's premature for us to recommend changes of this magnitude that are recommended without knowing more about the DCPS budgets for this year, and thus as proposed in these bills for perpetuity. For secondary schools, we would look at a requirement that planning periods at a minimum be incorporated into the formula and that class size be set to allow for electives and advanced classes, along with adequate staffing for ELL and SPED.
Our biggest concern is with the switch in budgeting from in the first year based on actual teacher salaries to average, as you've heard from others. First, the WTU contract would prohibit this, and rightfully so, because using average salaries is what protects schools from discriminating against more experienced educators. Second, the chairman has noted that under this formula, about half of the schools would have a larger base budget and half would have a lower one in the first year it is in effect. Then we would build from there. So I did a calculation based upon a representative sample of schools in each ward to see how this change would possibly impact schools in the first year. Many of our lowest income schools actually have the highest percentage of teachers with 10 years of experience or more. So in the first year, these schools, which need additional money, might get it. But the problem is that in all of the successive years, these schools would then have the largest incentive to turn over their more experienced educators. If you ensure that they will have at least last year's budget after 1 year, but year one was based on actual salaries, there's a huge perverse incentive for principals and LSATs to consider that they could, in many cases, replace one teacher with two. You may not find them likely to make that decision, but we should not be creating an incentive for them to do something that could harm the quality of teaching.
Just last month, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory highlighting the urgent need to address the nation's youth mental health crisis. Let us use this crisis to have a renaissance at DCPS. This is the perfect opportunity for DCPS to become a whole child-centered, anti-racist organization. For far too long, our students have been nickeled and dimed by the budgeting process. For a new budget process to work, our local LSATs must be empowered with real decision-making authority. Far too often, they operate with limited information in a rushed timeframe and serve as little more than a rubber stamp for central office priorities.
Transparency and predictability would be helpful qualities of a funding formula, but the formula itself needs to be adequate and equitable, and we don't know yet that it is either. School support funds also need to be allocated equitably.
If the committee's goal is to ensure more stability, we don't think that requiring schools to adjust to another new model just after they've had a new one is the best way to achieve that. We're also concerned about the potential fiscal year 24 application, given DCPS schools would be required to use the 23 budgets as the baseline. And again, we don't know if the baseline in 2023 is going to be better or worse than what schools are getting right now.
I think we're all here for the same reason, which is we need these budgets to actually work for the principals, teachers, and students that they're meant to serve.
Taken together, the two bills have admirable and worthy aims for which we applaud the council: priority and stability for DCPS budgets. However, DCPS is just over 1/2 of our public school system. Public charter schools, which have a greater population of students of color, will still see the threat of budget fluctuations. We urge the council to follow paid parent leaders' example and look for cross-sector solutions to ensure that all of our students are the beneficiaries of a just funding system.
We know that although the cuts have happened and then been restored in recent years, that has a dramatic impact on students and parents. Teachers and support staff are often placed in a tenuous position of not knowing if their job will exist next year, and they might choose jobs in other schools or other districts, contributing to high rates of teacher turnover.
So we've said it before, and clearly we have to say it again. Budgets are moral documents and are the foundation upon which our education programming is built. It is simply not possible to achieve our ambitious and important equity goals without equitable funding. I have pored over budget documents and attempted to figure out if H.D. Woodson was getting the money it was owed by law. DC Public Schools has consistently made that almost impossible, taking up hours and hours of time just trying to get the right number that we are owed by law that would be better strategizing what to do with the proper amount of money.
The focus of these bills is on stability. But one reality of DC education is that very little about our system is stable. Mechanisms described in these bills set us up, perhaps inadvertently, for a system of potential double payment for phantom students in our dual sector system. It also seems to lack any protections for requiring appropriate increases for DCPS schools which experience enrollment growth in a given year. As I understand it, in addition to student mobility, growing costs of both labor and non-personnel services are key factors in school budget changes year over year.
And if we actually empower principals with more autonomy, because they don't have to be fighting for their budgets, they know what their budgets are, and they can program next year based on what this year's budget is, then I think we'll see principals empowered to advocate for more programming in their schools.
Today, I'm eager to share more about our planned revisions to the school budget model. The proposed revisions are based on 3 factors: enrollment, targeting student need, and year-over-year stability.
My budget, I'm a principal, and my budget this year is 100,000 and proposed next year is 95,000. So what you did in the past was you simply added 5,000 when everybody screamed and I was up to 100. But now what you're going to do is go through some analysis. Well, if you're going to go through some analysis, it seems to me that it could end up that I don't get my 100. I end up getting something between 95 and 100.
Yeah, I just don't see it that way, Chairman. I see this really as an opportunity for us to consider multiple factors that would allow us to determine if a school need additional resources. There are many programmatic shifts that occur that we would review. For example, many people referenced today. Oftentimes there are changes in special education programming year over year, other unique circumstances that change a school budget.
Why hasn't DCPS shared mock budgets for each school using the new budget model? I don't agree with your response to the council's letter that sharing these would cause confusion. Why can't we see how the new model will affect schools theoretically before jumping into the LSAT process?
Right, so it is a challenge, Councilman Lewis George, of having the inputs. So once we know the funding levels, we can create a budget and schools will be able to see their budget for this school year.
How will the new budget model ensure the at-risk funds are used to supplement and not supplant regular funding as is required?
Thank you so much for asking that question, because one of the reasons we believe that this model is so important in lieu of the legislation is it allows us to create a separate grant allocation that would be aligned with the percentage of dollars that go directly to schools based on the number of at-risk students in their building. But if you base the budget solely on this year's budget in perpetuity, you don't account for student need.
Let me try again. I have a budget under this scenario, $1 million. My actual payroll, because they're all experienced teachers, is, let's say, $1.1 million. Well, I don't have a budget for 1.1 million. So when the teachers get paid 1.1 million, where does that money come from?
It comes from the entire teacher salary pot. So when we budget for salaries, we budget for the entire system.
Okay, so then I'm having to guess here because you're not helping me. So does $1 million come out of my budget and then another 100,000 come out of DCPS Central? It doesn't entirely come out of DCS Central because I have a budget of.
So each school is carrying the average salary cost. They're not covering actual salary costs, which is what I don't recommend. So I don't recommend, and again, I think this goes against our collective bargaining agreement.
But I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you how teachers are actually paid. Where does the money come from? If so, 1 million is parked in my school and they cost 1.1 million, right, where does the money come from?
So if you have 10 teachers, you're allocated the salary for those 10 teachers. That's where it comes from.
They cost more than that.
You're allocated their actual salary, even though you are basing their budget at the school level on an average salary.
So I have a budget in this scenario of $1 million and I'm paying them 1.1 million.
You at the school level are not paying them, the system is paying them.
Because one of the bills that we have here is essentially one that would require a home harmless, not just for an upcoming year, but in subsequent years. Is that something that you could get behind, or is that something that you feel like is a challenge for the system?
I think we should look at each year differently because I think the circumstances that we're in this year are different.
It is not our thinking at this time that we will try to rush a bill to markup and require changes in the mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 23. This is taking the long view of what the budget process is.